The Ninth Book and the Watches of Ashoka, Episode 1. I remember the humid air clinging to my clothes like a persistent lover that I could not peel away, no matter how many times I tried to fan myself with my notebook. I was in Ceylon, what is now Sri Lanka, on a modest archaeological expedition funded by my department at Oxford. Officially, I was there to research Portuguese colonial remnants on the island, but I had a private interest in older, deeper mysteries. My name is Dr. Edgar Bromley, and I've spent the better part of my 36 years consumed by the faint trails of antiquity. My interest had always been in minor artifacts, or so I told my supervisors, yet if I were honest, my fascination ran into the domain of hidden lore, secret histories that defy neat classification. Occasionally, I would indulge in the notion that I was more of a detective than a historian, sifting through dusty archives for clues that might point to something beyond the official records. That particular morning, I found myself in the shadow of a half-buried structure believed to date back to the Anuradhapura period. Though the site was modest, it still felt like a labyrinth of half-collapsed corridors, earthen mounds, and overgrown vegetation. There was an austere elegance to these ruins, an echo of the grand civilizations that once thrived here. I was accompanied by two local assistants, Ravi and Suren. Both were indispensable for their knowledge of the local terrain, languages, and legends. They were not university-trained archaeologists, but they had grown up hearing whispered stories about the island's ancient marvels. We had received permission to excavate the basement of a collapsed temple, rumored to date back at least 1,000 years. Much of the site had succumbed to erosion, the precarious environment, and centuries of pillaging. Yet, rumors persisted that somewhere beneath the rubble lay a small crypt, a repository for a few invaluable palm leaf manuscripts or scrolls that had not been properly inventoried. The notion was romantic, like searching for hidden treasure under the scorching sun. I fully expected to find a few battered remnants of old religious texts, if I was lucky, and perhaps broken pottery at best. That day, the early morning sun cast elongated shadows across the remaining pillars. Ravi called out in Sinhala to Suren, who promptly hurried over to me, his eyes shining with excitement. They had discovered a small stone door hidden behind a collapsed statue. The door itself was worn smooth by centuries of neglect, but there were faint inscriptions that I strained to make out. Sanskrit, perhaps, or an older script from the subcontinent, though I'm no expert in epigraphy. We had to clear layers of dirt, thick vines, and a smattering of debris, but soon we revealed a rectangular entryway, sealed by a heavy granite slab. I remember Suren wiping his brow and looking to me for direction. There was no question in my mind. We had to open it. With the help of ropes, levers, and a good deal of sweat, we managed to shift the slab. A dusty gust of stale air exhaled from the darkness within, an ancient breath that had not felt the fresh warmth of daylight in centuries. The moment was electric. I recall the hush that fell over the group, no idle chatter or laughter. In the presence of something so old, so secret, it felt almost sacrilegious to speak. Torchlight flickered against the stone walls as we descended a short flight of steps. The room was small, perhaps the size of an average cellar, its walls lined with niches that might have once held idols or ritual objects. In the center, resting atop a low rectangular altar, was a sealed clay container about the size of a shoebox. My heart hammered against my ribs. Such vessels were not unheard of in ancient temples, often used to store relics or scrolls. My mind ran wild with speculation. The dryness of the sealed chamber gave me a glimmer of hope that if there were manuscripts within, they might be intact. I approached reverently, feeling as though my entire academic career had led to this singular moment. Carefully, with gloved hands, I pried open the lid. Inside lay a single scroll wrapped in a brittle cloth. It was more delicate than anything I had ever handled, and it took all my caution not to unravel it too quickly. The cloth itself seemed simple, but there was a faint pattern woven into it, an intricate design that looked vaguely Buddhist in nature, but also possessed motifs I couldn't immediately identify. The scroll, made of a material that could have been a form of parchment, was inscribed with what appeared to be a mix of Sanskrit and Pali. My initial translation attempts were haphazard, but I could pick out references to an emperor, war, and a group described obliquely in ways that indicated secrecy. Words like guhya, secret, and gopaniya, to be concealed, kept recurring. I remember a moment of sheer wonder, and for a fleeting second, fear. Who had placed this scroll here, and for whom had it been intended? I signaled Ravi to bring me my camera and notepad. I needed to document everything meticulously. For hours we took photographs, wrote down notes, and carefully rewrapped the scroll. We decided that the final translation and analysis would have to wait until we returned to more controlled conditions. That night, my excitement prevented me from sleeping. I lay on a simple cot inside our makeshift camp, illuminated by a small lantern. Outside, the crickets formed a chorus that reminded me I was far from home. It was well past midnight when I started my initial attempts to translate the text in earnest. The references to Emperor Ashoka startled me. Everyone knows Emperor Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor who embraced Buddhism after the bloody Kalinga War. His edicts are found across the Indian subcontinent, urging moral conduct and respect for life. But the scroll mentioned him in a context I had not encountered in any standard historical account, as the founder of a secret society known as the Nine Unknown Men. My academic training told me to be skeptical. There are countless legends about ancient emperors, especially one as revered as Ashoka, but there was something in the script, an urgency in the words, that prevented me from dismissing it outright. The text alluded to Navaguptadharaka, literally the 9 keepers of secrets. Each was entrusted with a grantha, book, of such power that it had to be guarded vigilantly from those who might misuse the knowledge. The scroll was not exhaustive, but it hinted that these 9 guardians had been chosen by Ashoka to preserve and develop scientific knowledge in fields like medicine, physics, astronomy, and psychological arts, knowledge that could prove devastating if harnessed for ill intent. The bizarre twist in the text, and the reason I was certain I'd never encountered any mention of this legend in standard histories, was the suggestion that these 9 keepers transcended normal human lifespans. The wording was elliptical, but phrases like Puna Udbhava, rebirth, and Kalatrayam, 3 times or across time, kept appearing, hinting at reincarnation or continuity beyond the mortal coil. Was this purely symbolic language? Metaphorical? Or was it implying that these 9 individuals literally survived through the ages, passing on their roles in a cycle of rebirth? Before I could dive any deeper, the lantern's wick sputtered out. I was left in the dark, lying awake for hours, my heart racing with the rush of discovery. Sleep finally overtook me just before dawn. When I awoke, I could hardly wait to share my preliminary findings with my colleagues back at Oxford. But as events would soon unfold, my road to revealing the truth would be fraught with disbelief, academic scorn, and, a part of me shudders to admit, a brush with what I can only describe as the supernatural. We spent the next few days carefully cataloguing the entire site, but the discovery of the scroll overshadowed everything else. When I finally boarded a steamer back to England, the precious artifact was carefully sealed and wrapped in multiple layers, secured in a watertight container. My heart pounded with anticipation during the entire journey, uncertain whether the Royal Society and my peers at Oxford would accept or dismiss my shocking find. Part of me expected an outpouring of excitement, but another part recalled how unkind the academic world can be to ideas that challenge established narratives. Throughout the voyage, I scribbled notes incessantly, refining my partial translations. The more I revisited the text, the more convinced I became that I was on the verge of uncovering a story that would rattle conventional understanding of ancient Indian history. Perhaps it was the warm breeze on the deck or the shimmer of the night sea, but something in me felt that this was not merely a legendary curiosity, but a hidden key to a past that was far more complex and potentially more dangerous than we usually allow ourselves to imagine. I arrived in Southampton on an overcast morning. Rain pelted the harbour, and the sense of returning to a familiar gloom after the bright sun of Ceylon filled me with a contradictory mix of relief and apprehension. I was anxious to see the reaction on my colleagues' faces when they read the text, especially the wilder claims about reincarnation and advanced knowledge. Part of me hoped that my translations might be off, that perhaps I had misread the references, but another part clung to the possibility that I had stumbled upon something genuinely extraordinary. Little did I realize that as soon as I set foot in my cramped office at Oxford, my life would change irrevocably. The legend of the 9 unknown men was no mere myth tucked away in a forgotten scroll. Forces I could hardly fathom would soon converge around this secret, and my role would be far larger than that of a mere translator of ancient texts. If I had known, would I have turned back? I still don't have a definitive answer. But what I do know is that once the truth sets its hooks in you, there is little chance of returning to the comforting anonymity of ignorance. Episode 2. Once I was back in Oxford, I wasted no time contacting a few trusted colleagues. Professor Charles Winfield, a Sanskrit scholar of some renown, was my first port of call. Though somewhat pedantic, he was scrupulously precise in translations, and I wanted a second opinion on the more obscure terms. I also reached out to Dr. Margaret Thomason, a specialist in South Asian religious iconography who had a knack for spotting patterns in art and texts that most of us overlooked. The Royal Society meeting was scheduled a fortnight later, where I would present some preliminary findings. The aim was to gauge the reaction of a broader group of academics and, if they were receptive, obtain additional funding for further research. I remember the rainy afternoon when I sat with Winfield in a quiet corner of the Bodleian Library, carefully unrolling a facsimile of the scroll. The original was deemed too fragile for repeated handling. We pored over every line, cross-referencing grammar, syntax, and possible variants of translation. At first, he hummed softly, the way he always did when focusing. But after several minutes, he lifted his head, peered at me over his wire-rimmed spectacles, and said, "This is interesting." That one word, interesting, was his way of saying, there might be something here. We discussed Emperor Ashoka's historical context. Ashoka, after the infamous Kalinga War, had indeed renounced further conquests and become an advocate for the Dharma, founding monuments and pillars across the subcontinent. But the notion that he established a secret society of 9 men, each entrusted with advanced knowledge, did not appear in any widely accepted historical records. Still, references to the 9 unknown men had long circulated in fringe texts and popular lore. I recalled reading a 19th-century French writer, Louis Jacoliot, who mentioned them in passing, though his accounts were dismissed by mainstream historians as sensational and poorly sourced. Yet here I was, holding what seemed like a primary source, an ancient scroll that predated any European account. More remarkable were the references to the distinct areas of knowledge each of the 9 men guarded. One line read, if I recall correctly, Ya Shaktim Ashesam Likhati Natasmai Pratipadayet, roughly translating to, he who records boundless power, do not let him reveal it. This was presumably about the keeper of advanced physics or something akin to it. Another passage named Rochana Chikitsa, or luminous healing, which Winfield and I speculated might allude to some aspect of medicine. There were also cryptic references to the arts of influencing minds, manodvesha samvid, which I could only interpret as psychological manipulation or persuasion. Winfield's excitement was tempered by academic caution. We should cross-check with other inscriptions and known texts, he advised. To put forth such claims, particularly the mention of reincarnation, will invite significant skepticism. But it wasn't merely the mention of reincarnation. The scroll described how these 9 guardians were replaced once the holder of a particular book was nearing death. The knowledge would be passed on meticulously, and the new holder would take on the spiritual lineage of the old. It implied a chain of custodians, each inheriting not just texts, but a sort of living consciousness from the predecessor. Despite my rational skepticism, I felt a twinge of awe. Could such a tradition have continued hidden through the centuries? As the days passed, I began to notice a subtle tension around me. I might have shrugged it off as paranoia, but it persisted. While walking across the Oxford Quad, I often felt as if someone's eyes were on me, a fleeting presence vanishing the moment I turned around. At first, I thought it was just anxious excitement over my discovery. But one afternoon, as I left Winfield's office, I glimpsed a man, tall, dark-haired, wearing an inconspicuous grey suit, lingering at the far end of the corridor. He met my gaze with an intensity that sent a chill through me. Then he disappeared around a corner. When I hurried after him, all I found was an empty hallway. Shrugging off such incidents, I told myself it was my nerves. After all, I was steeped in ideas of conspiracies and secret societies. My mind could be playing tricks on me. Still, the sense of being watched did not abate. In the midst of these unsettling feelings, I continued preparing for the Royal Society presentation. The day arrived quicker than expected. The main hall was not a grand auditorium, but a medium-sized conference room replete with oak paneling and a lingering smell of old books. The audience comprised around 30 scholars, most from our academic circle, historians, linguists, archaeologists, and a few curious onlookers who'd heard rumors of a sensational find. I wore my best tweed suit and carried a small leather case containing both the facsimile of the scroll and my notes. My presentation began with a general overview of the excavation site in Ceylon. Then I shifted to the moment I discovered the sealed crypt, the clay container, and the scroll within. The audience seemed intrigued but not necessarily spellbound. Archaeological finds of old manuscripts in Asia are not unheard of. Only when I displayed the translations on a large projector slide did the room grow quiet. I walked them through the references to Ashoka, the 9 unknown men, and each of the 9 fields of knowledge, from the manipulation of gravitational forces to the secret treatises on medicine, from psychological warfare to prophecy. I could sense the tension thickening. Some members of the audience exchanged skeptical glances, while others leaned forward in rapt attention. Then I delved into the idea of reincarnation or a succession of custodians. I admit I felt a pang of nervousness. The notion was so far removed from standard historical discourse. The sound of a muffled cough in the back made me realize a few of my senior colleagues were struggling not to scoff openly. After I finished, the floor opened for questions. A half-dozen hands shot up at once. The first query came from Professor Harold Whitcomb, an elderly scholar known for his scathing critiques of any historically unorthodox claims. Dr. Bromley, he began, adjusting his round spectacles, are we to understand that you believe the Emperor Ashoka created a society of 9 men who preserve secrets of advanced sciences across millennia, passing them on via reincarnation? Does this not sound a bit like the stuff of myth rather than serious scholarship? I cleared my throat. I appreciate your question, Professor. The text I've translated references a lineage of 9 keepers, yes. It uses words that can be interpreted as reincarnation, or spiritual succession. Whether this is literal reincarnation or a metaphorical handover of knowledge is open to debate. I'm simply presenting the direct translations and the context in which I found them. Another hand rose. Dr. Clarissa McDowell, a young archaeologist. Even if the document is authentic and old, how do we know the author wasn't simply recording legends or hearsay? That is indeed a possibility, I conceded, but the level of detail and the manner in which it references known historical events of Ashoka's reign, such as the edicts, the shift in his policies, suggests some grounding in factual context. We must investigate further. A quiet voice then interjected from the back. And you truly believe these 9 men might still exist today? It was Dr. Thomason. She spoke softly, but every ear in the room caught her question. At this point, I paused. The rational historian in me resisted the idea, yet the text and certain intangible feelings I'd experienced, the sense of being watched, gnawed at me. I don't have enough evidence to make that claim, Dr. Thomason. However, the document implies a continuous secret tradition. Whether they still exist in the modern era is a matter for speculation. The session ended on a note of uncertainty. A few colleagues approached me afterward to offer tentative encouragement or express polite skepticism. Others left with bemused smiles, as if they'd just heard a tall tale. Yet amid this swirl of conflicting responses, one figure stood out. A tall, dark-haired man leaning against the back wall, quietly observing. He was not anyone I recognized from the academic community. As soon as I locked eyes with him, he turned and stepped out of the hall. My heart thudded in my chest. The same man I had seen in the corridor before? It couldn't be a coincidence. I hurried to the corridor, but again, he was gone. For the second time, the strange sense of foreboding washed over me. Something told me I was treading on dangerous ground. That evening, I returned to my modest flat, overshadowed by a mix of triumph and fear. I had stirred the waters of mainstream scholarship with a discovery that was either monumental or ludicrous. The academic repercussions would unfold in due time, but my intuition told me other, less visible forces were already mobilizing, watching my every move. Episode 3. The immediate aftermath of my presentation was an avalanche of mixed feedback. In private, Winfield was congratulatory, excited for the new translations we might uncover. Thomason remained politely optimistic, though I could sense a caution in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. Whitcomb, predictably, wrote a terse letter to the department head, questioning the methodological rigor of my claims. Life trudged on at the university with the usual lectures, marking student papers and departmental meetings. But beneath the mundane routine, a mounting tension simmered. My nights were plagued by vivid dreams. In them, I saw 9 hooded figures standing in a circle around a massive lotus carved from stone. Their faces were indistinct, blurred as if masked by swirling smoke. I'd wake in a cold sweat, my pulse pounding, only for the dream to slither away from my conscious grasp. By daylight, I would stare at my notes and wonder if I was allowing the legend to infect my subconscious. A week after the Royal Society talk, Winfield and I decided to do a more comprehensive analysis of the scroll. We spent long hours in his dusty office, cross-referencing with other ancient texts. I became increasingly convinced of its authenticity. The scroll's references matched certain obscure phrases in Ashokan edicts found in marginal sites that never made it into mainstream translations. Some words appeared to be coded. If we applied certain known ciphers used in ancient Indian traditions, like the Atbash-like transposition that sometimes appears in tantric texts, the meaning would slightly shift, hinting at advanced principles in geometry or cosmic measurements. It was enough to make my head spin. It was during one of these deep research sessions that a letter arrived for me. A single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper typed in an elegant font. Cease your inquiries. You are stepping into realms you do not understand. Let the ancient secrets remain in peace. There was no signature. My throat tightened as I read it. The letter was not overtly threatening, but the warning was clear. I showed it to Winfield. He frowned, perplexed. Someone is playing a game with you, Bromley, he said in a low voice. Or perhaps someone truly wants this kept quiet. Have you told the police? I shrugged. What would I say? That I received an anonymous letter telling me to stop researching a centuries-old legend. Unless there's a direct threat or evidence of a crime, they won't do much. I tried to dismiss the letter as a hoax from some overzealous critic. But part of me kept remembering the dark-haired stranger who seemed to vanish whenever I approached him. My instincts whispered that this was more than just academic rivalry. A creeping sense of danger began to color everything I did. One evening, while walking home, I became certain I was being followed. The footsteps behind me would quicken when I quickened mine, slow when I slowed. Heart racing, I abruptly turned into a narrow alleyway between two old buildings. I peered around the corner, half expecting to see that tall stranger. But no one passed by. I stood there for several minutes, breath clouding in the cool night air, feeling foolish and vulnerable. When I finally emerged and continued home, I heard no more footsteps. Yet the weight of that fear lingered. Back in my flat with the door securely locked, I tried to immerse myself in the scroll again to calm my nerves. My eyes caught a line that I had glossed over before. As the mortal form yields, so does the book find its next keeper, drawn by karmic threads that bind the knowledge across yugas. The phrase karmic threads was unusual. It implied a cosmic design behind the selection of new guardians. I wondered, with a surge of excitement and anxiety, if in all these centuries the keepers had continued their vigil, possibly working in the shadows of different societies, shaping events from behind the curtain. The rational part of me dismissed such thoughts as the result of reading too many fantastical texts, but the more imaginative part found it increasingly plausible. During these days, I also noticed a subtle shift in Thomason's behavior. She began asking me pointed questions about my interest in the scroll, how I first learned of the rumored crypt, and whether I had disclosed everything I found. Her curiosity seemed a tad more intense than academic zeal. Once I casually mentioned the letter I'd received. She listened with wide-eyed interest, but then her questions became oddly evasive. So you think these 9 men might be real? Like, actually living among us? She hesitated, then added, or do you believe they died long ago, and only the idea remains? Honestly, Margaret, I'm uncertain, I answered. Everything is speculation. Why do you ask? She looked away, fiddling with the hem of her jacket. No reason. It's a fascinating concept, isn't it? A faint tremor ran through her voice. I had the distinct impression she was probing for more information, or possibly verifying what I truly knew. A pang of suspicion tugged at me. Could she be part of the same group that sent me the note? That seemed absurd. I'd known her for years. She'd never given me reason to doubt her. But in the climate of secrecy and uncertainty, my trust in everyone was shaken. Despite the undercurrent of paranoia, the academic in me refused to let the matter drop. I resolved to follow a new lead, an obscure reference in the scroll to this message from the guardians to the faithful of the southern seas. If the 9 unknown men were keepers of knowledge, might there be other repositories or references hidden in different parts of Asia? On a whim, I wrote to a contact in Calcutta, a fellow historian named Dr. Suresh Menon, who specialized in rare Indian manuscripts. I mentioned I had discovered a text referencing secret knowledge from Ashoka's time, and asked if he had come across anything similar. To my surprise, he replied almost immediately, asking me to come to Calcutta. "I might have something you'll find very interesting," he wrote, "but these matters are best discussed in person, not in letters." His urgency piqued my curiosity. Though I was reluctant to leave Oxford in the midst of the tension, the prospect of learning more about the 9 unknown men was too tantalizing. I planned a trip to Calcutta during the winter break, but as I arranged my travel documents and made final preparations, another letter arrived, this time with a more direct warning. "We will not caution you again. Cancel your journey." I held the note with trembling hands. A flush of anger mingled with fear. Who were these people, presuming to control my research? The historian in me bristled at the thought of abandoning a promising lead. I decided, perhaps recklessly, that I would not be cowed. The next morning, I boarded a ship bound for India, leaving behind the gloomy skies of England for the teeming streets of Calcutta. I had no idea that this decision would plunge me headlong into an encounter with truths and perils beyond anything I had ever imagined. Episode 4. Arriving in Calcutta was like stepping into another world. The city teemed with life, rickshaws, motorcars, trams, and a vibrant swirl of humanity. The colonial architecture bore witness to its history under British rule, while the labyrinthine alleys offered a glimpse of an older, deeper tradition. I had corresponded with Dr. Menon for years, but we had never met in person. He had arranged for a car to pick me up at the port. As I stepped out into the humid air, a driver holding a placard with my name ushered me into a battered ambassador taxi. The ride to Menon's residence was disorienting. We wove through congested streets, past hawkers selling everything from roasted peanuts to exotic spices. Street urchins wove in and out of traffic, their laughter contrasting with the constant blare of horns. The cacophony was overwhelming. When we finally pulled up to Menon's modest home in an older neighborhood, I felt a sense of relief. A tall gate opened to a courtyard lined with potted plants, and at the door stood Menon himself, a thin, bespectacled man in his early 50s with a warm smile that belied a serious, studious demeanor. He welcomed me inside, apologizing for the lack of air conditioning. His living room was cramped but cozy, the walls lined with bookshelves, stuffed to bursting with rare tomes and manuscripts. Over a cup of sweet, milky tea, we got down to business. I handed him copies of the photographs of the scroll. Menon studied them intently, nodding every so often. "I have come across references to the 9 unknown men in a handful of scattered texts," he explained. "Most are couched in mythic language. One tantric scripture from the 9th century mentions 9 lights that guide the wheel of Dharma. Another, more cryptic line from a commentary on the Yogini Tantra talks of a hidden circle of 9 guardians who hold the secrets of time. Yet none are as explicit as what you've uncovered. This is extraordinary." I found myself feeling a renewed thrill of discovery. Is there anything more tangible? Something that might confirm that this wasn't just poetic allegory? Menon motioned for me to follow him to a small study at the back of the house. Inside, on a rickety wooden table, lay a chest of polished teak. He opened it carefully, revealing a bundle of ancient palm leaf manuscripts. My pulse quickened. Could this be another piece of the puzzle? He pulled out a single folio wrapped in red cloth. "This," he said in a hushed tone, "was given to me by a wandering ascetic I met near the Kumbh Mela many years ago. I thought it was just an odd curiosity, but after reading your letters, I revisited it. It mentions a meeting between Emperor Ashoka and a circle of 9 wise ones. It also references certain scientific feats, things that sound almost modern. Could be pure legend, of course, but the parallels are striking." As I carefully examined the folio, I noticed diagrams that looked oddly geometric. There were shapes resembling mandalas, but with lines that reminded me of modern circuit designs, though that notion felt absurd. The text repeated phrases similar to those in the scroll I found, including references to power that must not be unleashed. I could scarcely believe my eyes. We spent hours deciphering the archaic script, occasionally stumbling over obscure terms. Sometimes we would pause to sip tea or wipe away sweat in the stifling heat. Late into the evening, the overhead fan whirring uselessly, we had pieced together enough to confirm that both the scroll and this palm leaf manuscript were referencing the same mysterious group. The legend, it seemed, was more widespread than I had initially thought. At about midnight, we took a break. Menon's wife had prepared a simple meal of rice, lentils, and spiced vegetables. As we ate, I confided in him about the warnings I had received and the strange man who seemed to follow me. He listened gravely, then said, "You may have stumbled onto something that people have killed to protect. Be careful, Dr. Bromley." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Despite the danger, curiosity and academic fervor still coursed through me. What do you think is the true nature of their secret? Some advanced knowledge? Something that surpasses our current scientific understanding? Menon shrugged. The legends speak of many things: weaponry that could destroy entire armies, psychological techniques to manipulate large populations, knowledge of immortality. One must separate hyperbole from plausible reality. Yet we cannot deny that Ashoka was a visionary. If anyone in ancient India could have had access to groundbreaking knowledge, it would be a ruler of his power and influence. After dinner, Menon insisted I stay in his guest room. I was grateful, though a part of me hesitated, thinking of the anonymous threats. But there was no safer place than under the roof of a respected academic, or so I hoped. As I lay in bed, listening to the city's distant bustle, the weight of the day's revelations pressed upon me. The 9 unknown men had, for centuries, been more than a mere rumor. Had they truly passed down their knowledge through carefully chosen successors? If so, where were they now? Sleep eventually overtook me, but not for long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to raised voices outside. I hurried to the window and saw Menon at the gate, talking fiercely to 2 silhouettes. I couldn't make out their faces, but they stood tall and unmoving, as though unperturbed by Menon's agitation. Then one of them handed him an envelope and spoke something I couldn't catch. Menon's tone softened, and he nodded, opening the gate just enough to take whatever was being offered. As soon as the strangers left, I hurried downstairs, nearly colliding with Menon in the corridor. "Who was that?" I asked, heart pounding. He looked rattled. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Just old acquaintances. It's nothing," he said, clearly lying. In his hand was a plain envelope that he tried to hide behind his back. Sensing my disbelief, he sighed, then handed me the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with text in impeccable English. "Dr. Menon, we appreciate your respect for ancient traditions. Kindly remember your promise. Refrain from disclosing certain information to Dr. Bromley or others. We will be watching." My stomach churned. "What promise? Who are they?" He hesitated. "I met these men some years ago at a private conference in Varanasi. Scholars, mystics. I'm not entirely sure. They seem to have extraordinary knowledge. They claim to belong to a lineage that guarded certain texts, ones that must remain hidden. They pressed me to keep silent about anything they showed me. I had almost forgotten about it. Now I suspect they know you're here." I felt both betrayed and sympathetic. Menon was clearly in over his head. "You're going to do what they say?" He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I'm not sure I have a choice. They wield influence, Bromley, more than you can imagine. But you must understand, I never intended to deceive you. I only wanted to help further your research responsibly." The tension was thick in the air. We spent the rest of the night in anxious discussion. At dawn, Menon suggested we visit a contact of his, a scholar of esoteric traditions who might shed more light on the 9 unknown men. Despite the threat, I agreed. We couldn't abandon the search now. If anything, this new development only confirmed that we were on the right track. That morning, we hired a taxi to an older part of the city near the banks of the Hooghly River. The area felt timeless, with winding alleys and dilapidated mansions that harkened back to the city's colonial grandeur. Menon led me to a house that bore no nameplate, just a heavy wooden door. After several knocks, an elderly servant let us in and ushered us to a parlor. The interior was dimly lit, with the scent of incense lingering in the air. Presently, an elderly man appeared, dressed in a simple white kurta. His posture was erect, and his eyes were alert, belying the countless wrinkles on his face. "This is Pandit Vikram," Menon whispered, "a scholar of many hidden traditions." Pandit Vikram greeted us and asked in a soft, raspy voice, "You come seeking knowledge of the 9 guardians?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yes, Panditji. We believe Emperor Ashoka established a secret group of scholars who possessed advanced knowledge. We've found references in manuscripts." He raised a hand. "I know. You are not the first to come searching for them, but be warned. There are powers that do not wish this knowledge to be disturbed. The 9 protect, yes, but others wish to exploit. You stand in the midst of a conflict older than you can fathom." A thrill of terror and excitement ran through me. "Panditji, do you believe they still exist? Is it a literal group of 9 men who pass their knowledge through reincarnation or succession?" He gave a grave nod. "So the stories go. Not all stories are false, my friend." Then he motioned us to sit on cushions around a low table. From a chest, he took out a small, tattered manuscript. Opening it, he revealed passages of ancient Sanskrit. I recognized a few terms that matched those in my scroll, references to medicine, warfare, cosmic cycles. "Every few centuries," he said quietly, "there come glimpses of the 9's influence. They have guided certain rulers, toppled others, and ensured that certain catastrophic knowledge never falls into the wrong hands. But their secrecy is paramount. If you continue down this path, you risk more than your academic standing." He then showed us a depiction, a series of 9 lotus petals, each containing an emblem that represented different domains of knowledge. It was beautiful, yet disconcerting, the petals seeming to pulse with an uncanny symbolism. My skin prickled. "Why me?" I asked. "I'm just a historian from Oxford. Why am I caught in this?" He gave me a long, piercing look. "Perhaps you were meant to find that scroll. Perhaps the chain of destiny has led you here." Menon shifted uneasily, casting glances around, as though expecting intruders at any moment. We spent a tense hour with Pandit Vikram. Though he was generous with cryptic hints, he wouldn't divulge certain details, claiming they were not his to share. By the time we left, my head swam with revelations and new questions. Stepping back into the street's bright sunlight was like emerging from an underwater dream. The city's clamor enveloped me again, yet a part of me had changed irreversibly. The 9 unknown men were no longer a fringe legend in my mind. They were a tangible force, with adherents and watchers, and possibly a centuries-long mission. My curiosity burned brighter than ever, but so did my fear. I was a man stumbling blindly through a labyrinth of secrets, uncertain which path led to the truth and which led to destruction. Episode 5. I stayed with Menon for another week, poring over texts, cross-referencing, and meeting with a few more reclusive scholars. Each encounter confirmed the same refrain. The 9 unknown men were a legend, with surprisingly consistent details, scattered across centuries and regions. The knowledge they guarded was said to be both beneficial and perilous, ranging from advanced medicine that could eradicate diseases to lethal technologies that could annihilate civilizations. No one had incontrovertible proof, but the uniformity of these accounts was startling. All the while, a palpable sense of being surveilled gnawed at me. At times, I'd spot figures lurking at the edge of gatherings or sense unmarked cars trailing our taxi. Menon told me in whispers that he, too, felt the presence of watchers outside his home at night. The tension made it impossible to sleep well. My dreams of hooded figures returned, more vivid than ever. In one dream, a hooded figure held out a book with pages of golden light. When I reached for it, my hand passed straight through, and I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. Toward the end of my stay, Menon and I resolved to visit Bodh Gaya, a place deeply associated with the Buddha and rumored to be significant in Ashoka's spiritual transformation. We hoped to find a clue in the ancient temples or libraries there. However, the night before our planned departure, I woke to a commotion downstairs. When I rushed down, I found Menon in a state of panic. His study had been ransacked, books and manuscripts strewn across the floor. A window had been forced open. We hurried to check the teak chest, but the palm leaf manuscript about Ashoka's meeting with the Nine was gone. Menon stared at the empty space in shock, tears welling in his eyes. "They took it," he whispered. "It's gone." There was no point calling the police. The men who did this weren't common thieves. They left behind valuable artifacts and took only the manuscript related to the 9 unknown men. Their message was clear. We were meddling in affairs that did not concern us. We debated whether to proceed with our trip or not. In the end, we decided that halting our search would be yielding to intimidation. Early next morning, with minimal luggage, we boarded a train to Gaya. The journey was long, over 5 hours, and the landscapes of rural India rolled past in a hypnotic blur of green fields and dusty towns. I remember staring out of the window, caught between excitement at the prospect of new discoveries and a growing dread that each step we took deeper into this mystery might be our last. Bodh Gaya greeted us with an austere serenity. The Mahabodhi temple stood majestic, thronged by monks and pilgrims from all over the world. The air was thick with incense and chants, a stark contrast to the bustling chaos of Calcutta. We found lodgings in a small guest house near the temple complex. Menon had arranged a meeting with a local scholar monk named Tenzin, who was rumored to have an extensive repository of texts on Buddhist history, some dating back to Ashoka's reign. We met Tenzin in a quiet courtyard behind a smaller shrine. He was a stout man with bright, penetrating eyes and a gentle smile. Over a simple meal of rice and vegetables, we explained our search. Tenzin listened politely, then led us to a small library in a separate building. The sweet smell of old paper greeted us. Shelves lined the walls, filled with texts in Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and a host of other languages. For hours we combed through texts while Tenzin provided commentary. Many references existed to Ashoka's support of Buddhism, his pilgrimages, and the missionary efforts he funded to spread the Dharma. Yet there was little about a secret society. Finally, near dusk, Tenzin pulled down a dusty volume from a high shelf. It was a Pali chronicle, rarely consulted, that described King Ashoka's royal court. One passage captured our attention. It alluded to 9 courtiers whose names were never recorded, men so learned that Ashoka sought their counsel in private. The text was vague, but it mentioned how these 9 were tasked with preserving knowledge for the sake of all sentient beings, safeguarding it from those who walk the path of darkness. My skin prickled at the resonance with the legend of the 9 unknown men. Though the text didn't specify advanced sciences or reincarnation, the connection was unmistakable. As we sat there, my mind wandered back to the unrelenting watchers, the theft at Menon's house, and the threatening letters. A sobering realization dawned on me. If this knowledge was real, if there truly existed such powerful secrets that had been safeguarded for centuries, then it made sense that certain forces would do anything to keep it out of public awareness. The question that haunted me was, which side are we inadvertently helping, the guardians or those who'd exploit the knowledge? Tenzin soon revealed one more clue. He had heard from an old traveling monk of a rumored location in the Himalayan foothills, an ancient monastery where a fragment of the Nine Secrets was once stored. No one had confirmed its existence. It was said to be hidden in a narrow valley and protected by illusions or mystical wards, stories that sounded more like folklore than fact. But Tenzin insisted that if we were genuinely searching for the truth, this lead might be worth following. Menon and I exchanged glances. The Himalayan foothills were far, the journey perilous. My academic responsibilities in Oxford weighed on my mind. Was I truly prepared to go to such extremes? The thrill of the quest wrestled with the rational voice that told me to return home. But something in me refused to let it go. The Nine Unknown Men had become more than a historical curiosity. They represented a grand tapestry of knowledge and secrecy, weaving through centuries of human history. The thought of turning back now, leaving the story unfinished, felt impossible. We made arrangements for a guide who could take us into the foothills. It was an arduous task, as few in Bodh Gaya claimed any real knowledge of such a remote monastery. Eventually, we found a grizzled man named Rana, who demanded a handsome fee up front, but assured us he had navigated that region in his youth. We were to leave in 3 days' time. Those 3 days in Bodh Gaya were a blur of last-minute research and tense anticipation. Every time I walked through the temple grounds or the winding market alleys, I half expected a stranger in a grey suit to appear or another ominous letter to find its way into my pocket. None did, but the uneasy feeling never fully left me. On our final evening, Tenzin conducted a small prayer ceremony for our safety in one of the temple's smaller shrines. Monks chanted softly, their voices echoing off ancient stone walls. I stood there, inhaling the incense, trying to still my racing thoughts. Part of me questioned the sanity of our undertaking. Another part, the part that had always yearned for discovery beyond the dusty pages of established history, felt an almost gravitational pull toward the hidden folds of this enigma. We set out before dawn, traveling by train and then bus, crossing into more remote areas. The landscape changed from the flat plains to rolling hills. Eventually, we disembarked at a small village where Rana waited with a worn jeep. He gave us a curt nod, clearly not one for small talk. Menon and I loaded our minimal supplies, warm clothing, basic foodstuffs, some notebooks, and a camera. As we drove higher into the foothills, I couldn't help but think of the journey as a metaphor, a literal ascent toward hidden truths. The roads grew narrower, winding along cliffs that overlooked vast valleys below. After hours of bouncing along rutted paths, we reached a hamlet where the jeep could go no further. From here, we would proceed on foot. Rana led us along a rough trail, past terraced fields and across cold mountain streams. The air grew thinner, the sun's rays sharper. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged bursts. Menon fared no better. He was a scholar, not a mountaineer. Yet we pressed on. After 2 days of grueling trekking, we arrived at a secluded valley. Shrouded in mist, it had a haunting beauty. Towering pines whispered in the breeze, and somewhere distant, a waterfall roared. Rana pointed to a rocky outcrop. "Beyond those boulders is what you seek," he said, then insisted he would go no further. He wanted his payment and to return before nightfall. We complied, though his abrupt departure filled me with foreboding. Menon and I continued alone. The trail was faint, barely discernible. The sky was turning a bruised hue of purple as dusk approached. We rounded the boulders and found a narrow stone path leading to what appeared to be an ancient structure built into the mountainside. My heart leapt. Could this be the lost monastery? We approached cautiously. The building was partially collapsed, its once grand entrance now a weather-beaten archway. I saw no signs of recent habitation. Stepping through the arch, we entered a courtyard strewn with debris, broken stone tablets, fragments of sculptures, and moss-covered steps. The silence was uncanny, broken only by the wind sighing through the ruins. By the fading light, we explored the structure. We found a large hall whose walls bore faint murals, paint flaking off to reveal glimpses of robed figures, lotus motifs, and something that might have been the symbol of 9 petals. My chest tightened. Could this indeed be connected to the 9 unknown men? As darkness fell, we kindled a small fire in a sheltered corner. We dined on meager rations and decided to camp for the night. We would resume our exploration at first light. Menon fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted, but I lay awake, scanning the shifting shadows. My thoughts churned with everything that had led me here: the scroll in Ceylon, the warnings, the men who ransacked Menon's study, the watchers. Had we finally reached a repository of secrets that countless generations tried to hide? Suddenly, I heard soft footsteps echoing through the ruins. I froze. The footsteps seemed deliberate, not the random shuffle of an animal. My heart pounded. I carefully nudged Menon awake, and we both strained our ears. The steps ceased for a moment, then resumed, drawing closer. I thought of the hooded figures in my dreams and felt my skin crawl. If someone was here to protect the secret or to steal it, we were alone and vulnerable. Clutching my flashlight, I rose slowly. Menon stood beside me, beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cold night air. We peered into the darkness beyond our fire's glow but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. Had we imagined it? Or was someone watching us from the murky shadows? A tense hour passed without further sound. Eventually, I sank back onto my makeshift bedroll. Sleep eluded me, but fatigue won out. My last conscious thought was a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. We had come so far, risked so much. Tomorrow, we would search the ruins with fresh eyes. If the 9 unknown men left any trace here, we would find it. What I didn't realize was that the events of the next day would shatter any lingering assumptions I held about the line between myth and reality, and that I was perilously close to crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. Episode 6. Dawn came with a pale, diffused light. A thin veil of mist clung to the mountainside, giving the dilapidated monastery an ethereal glow. Menon and I roused ourselves, stiff from the cold night, and ate a quick breakfast of dried fruit and biscuits. We were eager to begin our exploration. The question of the mysterious footsteps still weighed on my mind, but daylight brought a cautious optimism. We started with the large hall, whose faint murals we'd glimpsed the previous evening. Armed with flashlights, we inspected the walls in greater detail. The faded images appeared to depict scenes of teaching and meditation, but in the far corner, we discovered a series of symbols that piqued our curiosity. They looked like script, but neither of us could identify it immediately. We took photographs and sketched the shapes in our notebooks. Further exploration led us to a smaller chamber accessible through a narrow corridor. The chamber had partially caved in, allowing a shaft of sunlight to illuminate a raised stone platform at the center. Carved into the platform was a lotus motif with 9 petals, reminiscent of the image Pandit Vikram had shown us. My breath caught in my throat. Menon's eyes lit up with the thrill of discovery. We circled the platform searching for any inscriptions or hidden compartments. That was when Menon noticed a small depression in the lotus center. It looked as if something might fit there, a stone or a sculpture. Tentatively, he pressed his hand against it. Nothing happened, but as he applied more pressure, the platform shifted slightly, revealing a hairline crack in the stone. Excitement surged. We pushed on various parts of the lotus symbol until, with a low groan, a section of the platform slid aside. Beneath was a hidden recess. Inside, we found a single object wrapped in decaying cloth. With trembling hands, I lifted it out. The cloth disintegrated at my touch, revealing a palm leaf manuscript, not unlike the one stolen from Menon's home, but older and more fragile. I carefully unwrapped the leaves. The script on them looked similar to the old Pali or Sanskrit styles we'd encountered, but with additional symbols. My heart hammered as I realized we might be holding a genuine relic connected to the 9 unknown men. Menon and I exchanged a glance of triumph, but it was laced with caution. This was the kind of find that could provoke the Watchers or their masters. We decided to study the manuscript right there, using the daylight streaming through the collapsed ceiling. The first lines were in archaic Sanskrit, mentioning Ashokavardhana, a reference to Emperor Ashoka, and a council of 9. My translation was shaky, but I gleaned enough to confirm the text spoke of a clandestine gathering, presumably the unknown men. The following passages were cryptic, mentions of Loka Kalyana, the welfare of the world, balanced against Mahavinasha, great destruction. My fingertips tingled as I traced the ink. This was the core of the legend, that the 9 safeguarded knowledge so potent it could either uplift or devastate humanity. Yet the text also hinted at a prophecy, something about a time of renewal when the knowledge would be revealed to worthy successors. The language was elliptical, full of poetic metaphors. Menon and I were so absorbed in our work that we almost didn't notice the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching. By the time we looked up, it was too late. 2 figures stood at the entrance of the chamber, blocking our exit. They were dressed in unremarkable hiking clothes, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about them. One was a tall, dark-haired man with a gaunt face, the very same stranger I'd glimpsed in Oxford, I was now certain. The other was slightly shorter, with close-cropped hair and hard, unwavering eyes. My pulse pounded in my ears. For a fleeting moment, none of us moved. Then the taller man spoke in precise English, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Dr. Bromley, Dr. Menon, we've come a long way to find you." My throat felt parched. "Who are you?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "That is irrelevant," he said. "What matters is that the manuscript you hold does not belong to you. Hand it over." Menon and I stood. We were cornered, the relic in our possession, and these men clearly had no intention of negotiating. Trying to remain calm, I said, "This is an important historical document. We're historians, not thieves. We have every right to study it." The man's companion stepped forward, eyes glinting. "This knowledge is not for public consumption. Surrender it." Fear mingled with anger in my gut. "And who decides that? Some secret society?" I shot back, surprising even myself with my boldness. They exchanged a look. The tall man stepped closer, his tone menacingly soft. "We are merely protectors. You have no idea what forces you are tampering with. The 9 have always worked to prevent misuse of sacred knowledge. If you continue, you place yourselves and many others at risk." The mention of the 9 sent a jolt through me. Could these men actually be connected to the legendary keepers, or were they from a rival faction seeking the knowledge for their own ends? My thoughts whirled. Menon, visibly shaking, clutched the manuscript tighter. "We won't give it to you," he said, though his voice trembled. This belongs to humanity's collective heritage. The shorter man sighed, as if dealing with recalcitrant children. Have it your way, he muttered, and reached inside his jacket. I tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small metallic sphere. He pressed a button on it, and instantly, a high-pitched whine filled the chamber. My vision blurred. I felt nauseous, disoriented, as though my equilibrium had been yanked away. Menon collapsed to his knees. I struggled to remain upright, my mind reeling. The sphere's whine intensified, and I was overcome by dizziness. My legs gave out, sending me sprawling onto the cold stone floor. Just before darkness claimed me, I saw the tall man reach down for the manuscript in Menon's limp hands. Then the world spun into oblivion. I drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by fragmented images, men speaking in hushed tones, the crackle of a fire, the battered walls of the monastery overhead. At some point I came to, my head throbbing fiercely. Night had fallen, and the chamber was illuminated only by the flicker of my dying flashlight. Menon lay nearby, still unconscious. Instinctively I checked my pack. The manuscript was gone, of course, but at least we were alive. That was something of a miracle. I crawled over to Menon, shaking him gently. He roused with a groan, blinking in confusion. We pieced together what had happened. The men had used some kind of device to incapacitate us without gunfire or physical violence. It was advanced. Maybe military technology we were unaware of, or something else entirely. Either way, the message was clear. They had the text, and we were left with nothing but bruises and questions. Menon's eyes brimmed with tears. "They took it," he said shakily. "Everything we came here for, gone." I put a hand on his shoulder. "We're lucky to be alive. Let's try to get out of here safely. We can't do anything more tonight." We spent a fitful night in the ruins, too exhausted to leave and too rattled to sleep. My thoughts churned ceaselessly. If these men indeed served the 9 unknown men, it suggested that the legendary guardians were real, enforcing secrecy with an iron hand. But my gut sense told me it wasn't that simple. They'd made no mention of preserving knowledge for the betterment of humanity. Their approach was purely threatening, driven by a desire to keep us in the dark. Could it be that they were part of a rogue faction, or a group, competing to find all the books of the 9? At dawn, we decided to return to the village where Rana had dropped us off. Perhaps he was still there, or we could at least find some mode of transportation. The trek back was grueling, both physically and emotionally. Our discovery, the fruit of months of labor, had been snatched from us in mere moments. Yet as we retraced our steps through the rugged trails, something inside me shifted. My fear mingled with determination. If such advanced knowledge truly existed, knowledge capable of controlling minds, healing diseases, or unleashing devastation, it needed responsible stewards. And if men like those who attacked us were in control, the world could be in grave danger. A part of me longed to simply return to the safety of Oxford, burying myself in predictable academic work. But another part, the part that had guided me this far, refused to abandon the quest. By the time we limped into the village, exhaustion weighed on us like lead. Rana was gone, of course. With some difficulty, we bartered for a ride back to the nearest railway station. During the bumpy ride, Menon asked, "What do we do now, Bromley? We have no proof, no manuscript. Those men will be watching us, maybe worse." I stared out the window at the passing hills. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know we can't give up. The 9 unknown men may have started as a noble order. But if people like those 2 are controlling the knowledge, it could be the greatest threat imaginable." Menon said nothing, but the look he gave me spoke volumes. We were 2 weary scholars, battered in spirit and flesh, pitted against clandestine powers, centuries in the making. The enormity of it dwarfed our personal fears. Perhaps we had a duty to shine a light into that darkness. A day later, we were back in Calcutta, nursing our wounds and booking passage back to England. Menon would stay behind for a while, tying up loose ends and checking if any of his contacts could salvage a lead. I, on the other hand, felt compelled to return home, if for no other reason than to reevaluate my priorities, my safety, and how best to proceed. As I boarded the steamer at the port of Calcutta, I was filled with a profound sense of unease. The 9 unknown men no longer felt like a distant legend. Their presence was real, tangible, and potentially cataclysmic. While the azure waters of the Indian Ocean stretched before me, calm and infinite, my mind wrestled with the storms of what lay ahead. Deep down, I sensed that my role in this unfolding drama was far from over. Episode 7. The return voyage to England offered me plenty of time to brood. Each evening I found myself on the deck, watching the sun dip into the horizon and replaying the events of the past weeks in my head. Emotions swung between regret and fierce resolve. Had I made a catastrophic error in delving so deeply into this legend? Or was I an unwitting instrument in a story that demanded resolution? Upon reaching Southampton, I disembarked with a combination of relief and dread. The crisp British air felt oddly stifling after the tropical heat of South Asia. My first priority was to deliver a report to my department at Oxford, though I had to be careful. My experiences in India taught me that open disclosure could invite danger, not just from academic skeptics, but from shadowy figures who'd already proven their willingness to act. Back at the university, I tried to slip into a semblance of my old routine: lectures, office hours, and endless stacks of essays to grade. The hustle of academic life was a strange comfort, a structured world seemingly distant from Himalayan monasteries and clandestine manuscripts. Yet every time I passed through the quad or wandered the corridors, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. News of my trip had circulated among the faculty. Curiosity abounded, and more than a few colleagues cornered me in the hall, peppering me with questions. "Did you find more artifacts in Ceylon? Any new revelations about Ashoka's times?" I maintained a guarded politeness, offering vague details and deflecting pointed inquiries. A week after my return, I was summoned to the office of the department chair, a stern woman named Dr. Avery. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "I understand you've been stirring interest with some rather unorthodox claims," she began. Her expression was icy. "We tolerate a wide range of scholarship, but rumors of reincarnation and secret societies, especially claims that you have no tangible evidence for, are damaging the department's reputation." I took a steadying breath. "Dr. Avery, I came across a remarkable document in Ceylon that alludes to a hidden tradition dating back to Emperor Ashoka. My subsequent research—" She cut me off. "But you lost the scroll, correct? Or it's locked away in your personal study, I'm told?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. I realized that someone had been spreading gossip, possibly that I was fabricating evidence. "The original scroll is safeguarded in a secure location," I lied, wanting to protect it from further scrutiny. "My work is ongoing, but I have partial translations and photographic records." Her frown deepened. "The Royal Society is considering an inquiry into your claims. If you cannot substantiate them, your reputation, and by extension this department's, could suffer." Anger and frustration coursed through me. The petty politics of academia felt trivial compared to the stakes I'd seen in India. Still, I forced myself to speak calmly. "I understand your concern. However, the nature of this discovery is delicate. I'm compiling my findings into a paper, but some aspects require circumspection due to potential cultural sensitivities." Her eyes flickered with disapproval. "Very well, Dr. Bromley. You have some time to provide a coherent account, but be warned. The university will not shield you from public criticism if your claims are deemed spurious. I left her office feeling as though a trap door had opened beneath me. The 9 unknown men were not the only threat. Academic condemnation could destroy my career just as effectively. Adding to my woes, an undercurrent of something far darker lurked in the background. If those watchers had followed me back to England, or if their agents were already ensconced in British society, I might never be free of them. Late that night, I sat in my dimly lit study, riffling through notes and photographs. My windows were locked, curtains drawn. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the panes. I tried to piece together a coherent narrative, one that might satisfy the skeptics without revealing too much. The stolen manuscript in India, the men who incapacitated me with a strange device, the cryptic references to advanced knowledge, these were not the stuff of typical academic discourse. Lost in thought, I almost didn't hear the scraping sound near my front door, but a faint thud jolted me upright. Heart pounding, I crept to the foyer. Through the frosted glass, I could make out a silhouette. Cautiously, I opened the door an inch. No one stood there, but at my feet lay an envelope. Instinctive fear rippled through me. Another warning? I brought the envelope inside and locked the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed, "Why did you return, Dr. Bromley? Cease this madness before more lives are lost." No signature, no date, just an unmistakable threat. My pulse drummed in my ears. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone peering through a window. Nothing but the swirl of nighttime shadows. My immediate impulse was to contact the authorities, but once again, what would I say? I had no proof that a crime was being committed. Exhaling shakily, I resolved to tuck the note away as further evidence of covert intimidation. A part of me felt oddly relieved. At least I wasn't imagining it. The watchers were indeed real. In the days that followed, I locked myself in a silent duel with my own apprehensions. The departmental pressure mounted. Dr. Avery's warnings weighed heavily. Winfield and Thomason offered cautious support, but insisted I present them with something concrete. Without the original scroll or a new piece of evidence, they argued, the academic tide would swiftly turn against me. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived from Manon. It was postmarked from an undisclosed location, no proper return address, just a cryptic scrawl of India. Inside, he detailed how he'd gone underground, fearing for his life after the break-in and our ordeal in the Himalayas. He wrote that he had discovered references to a final, crucial repository of the Nine's knowledge, the elusive Ninth Book, said to contain a treatise on controlling and transcending life itself. My breath caught at his mention that certain powerful factions, possibly the ones that attacked us, were also hunting for this Ninth Book. It was rumored to be hidden in a place known as Nagaravati, an ancient library whose location was lost to time. Menon was convinced that if the Ninth Book fell into the wrong hands, it could tip the balance between creation and destruction. He concluded by imploring me to stay vigilant. "We are pawns in a larger game," he wrote, "but perhaps our resolve can shape the outcome." The letter ignited a spark of renewed determination in me. If Menon was continuing the search, I couldn't stand idle in Oxford. The problem was how to proceed without endangering my position or my life. My nights became consumed by fantasies of returning to Asia, forging alliances with people who might guide me safely to this Nagaravati. But each time, I recalled the men who nearly killed us in that Himalayan monastery. If I resumed the quest, I might not survive the next encounter. Still, my sense of duty outweighed my fear. No matter the academic repercussions, the 9 unknown men phenomenon was too significant to ignore. Even if the reincarnation aspect was purely symbolic, the chain of guardianship clearly persisted. One sleepless night, I made up my mind. I would try to harness the resources of the Royal Society, not with wild tales of hooded immortals, but with a careful approach emphasizing the historical significance and possible undiscovered archives in Asia. I arranged a meeting with a small circle of scholars, those few I trusted enough to gauge their reaction. We gathered in a cramped conference room at the far end of the library, away from prying ears. I laid out the narrative, carefully omitting the more extreme incidents, focusing on the potential for undiscovered ancient texts of incalculable historical and scientific value. Initially, their faces reflected skepticism, yet as I showed them the photographs of the monastery ruins, the partial translations from the original scroll, and the references from Tenzin and Pandit Vikram, a quiet hush fell over the room. One by one, they asked measured, thoughtful questions. Some expressed fascination that advanced forms of science might have existed in Ashoka's time. Others doubted the more esoteric elements, but agreed the possibility of discovering new texts was exciting. By the end, a colleague named Dr. Huxley, an influential figure in the Royal Society, spoke up. "What you propose would be a substantial expedition, Bromley. We would need a team of archaeologists, linguists, perhaps even anthropologists, and funding. This is not a trivial matter." I exhaled, relief mingling with cautious optimism. "Yes, I understand. But if the rumors of hidden knowledge are even partially true, the payoff for historical scholarship would be immense." Huxley nodded slowly. "I'll talk to some potential sponsors, private ones perhaps. If this is as sensitive as you imply, it might be best to avoid too much official fanfare. We can't have the press running wild with talk of secret societies." That was a surprising turn. Maybe, just maybe, I could muster the resources needed to safely pursue this. But in my heart, I knew how dangerous it would be. Even with official backing, we'd be interfering with something centuries old and fiercely guarded. As the meeting ended, a cautious excitement rippled through the group. For the first time, I dared to hope that my academic community might stand behind me, or at least not brand me a lunatic. Walking back through the library halls, I felt lighter, though not entirely free of dread. We were about to poke a hornet's nest, some intangible spiderweb that spanned continents and centuries. The watchers would not idly stand by. That same evening, I found a plain envelope slipped under my office door. My chest tightened as I reached for it, expecting another threat. Instead, it contained a single note. "Knowledge must be tempered by wisdom, Dr. Bromley. Seek the counsel of the righteous, not the power-hungry. The cycle repeats, but you may yet choose your role. No demand, no explicit threat this time, just a cryptic admonition." Was this from a friend within the 9 unknown men, or a rival faction? My thoughts churned. Perhaps, amidst the secrecy, a splinter group within the 9 was more sympathetic, or maybe it was a cunning ploy to mislead me. Despite the swirling uncertainties, my mind was made up. A door had opened. The potential expedition, the new leads from Menon, and the unwavering sense that fate, or call it karma, had thrust me into this role. For better or worse, I would continue. The realm of the 9 unknown men was no mere academic curiosity. It was a living tapestry of knowledge, mysticism, and clandestine power. If I failed to see it through, who else would? The cycle was spinning anew, and I was caught in its center. If reincarnation existed in any sense, metaphorical or literal, perhaps I was stepping into shoes that had been worn by countless seekers before me, some triumphant, some tragically undone. The path was perilous, but the pull was irresistible. Little did I suspect how close the final reckoning was, or how shocking the end of this labyrinthine journey would be. Episode 8. Within 3 months, a small expedition was indeed assembled, funded discreetly by a consortium of wealthy patrons with an interest in advancing historical knowledge of the subcontinent. The plan was to travel to remote regions of northern India and Nepal, exploring leads gathered from Menon's letter and local monks who had knowledge of esoteric libraries. With diplomatic caution, we avoided any loud announcements or official statements, explaining only that we were conducting a scholarly survey of historical sites. The team comprised a handful of experts: Dr. Huxley for archaeology, Dr. Thomason for iconography, a linguist specializing in Old Tibetan scripts, and two graduate students who'd proven their mettle in fieldwork. I was the nominal lead, though the weight of that responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. In the back of my mind, I feared a repeat of the Himalayan monastery incident. Our base of operations was a small research center in Kathmandu. Upon arrival, we found messages from Menon waiting for us at the local post. The notes were cryptic. He hinted at an ancient route leading to a valley rumored to house the hidden library of Nagaravati. He also mentioned that shadowy figures were hunting for the same site, eager to unearth the ninth book. Menon's final scribbled line read, "Trust no one. The watchers are everywhere. We wasted no time." Huxley secured local guides who were sworn to confidentiality. We stocked up on provisions and headed into the mountainous regions north of Kathmandu, following Menon's clues. The journey stretched over rugged trails with yaks carrying our gear. The higher we climbed, the sparser the villages became, until we were navigating passes rarely seen by outsiders. One evening, camped beside a glacial stream, Thomason approached me. She looked uneasy. "Edgar," she said quietly, "there's something you need to know." She hesitated, twisting her hands. "I've been in contact with someone who claims to represent a group that's aligned with the 9 unknown men. They reached out before we left England." My heart lurched. "Aligned how?" "They warned that the Nine's knowledge is dangerous if revealed prematurely. They insisted we approach with reverence, that we not try to forcibly extract the secrets. I didn't know how to tell you." I felt a flash of anger and betrayal. "Why keep this from me?" She looked pained. "Because I wasn't sure what to believe. I thought they might be just another group wanting to manipulate the situation, but they claim that if we prove ourselves worthy, we might be granted access without violence." I stared at her, the crackling campfire reflecting in her eyes. Could it be that not all factions around the Nine were hostile? My mind churned with memories of the threatening letters, the attack in the monastery, the stolen manuscripts. "Do you trust them?" I asked finally. She exhaled. "I don't know, but given the circumstances, it seemed like a slender hope that we might avert another confrontation." Reluctantly, I thanked her for telling me. It complicated matters further, but perhaps it was better to have every piece of the puzzle, no matter how ambiguous. The next morning, we continued our trek, forging through narrow defiles where the wind howled like a mourning spirit. Eventually, we came upon a hidden valley, its entrance cloaked by natural rock formations. My heart pounded. This matched Menon's description of the place rumored to hide Nagaravati. The valley was eerily silent, strewn with boulders and dotted with sparse vegetation clinging to life in the harsh conditions. We scoured the area for signs of human craftsmanship, carvings, ruins, anything that might indicate a concealed structure. Late in the afternoon, one of the graduate students shouted from a rocky ledge. We scrambled up to find her pointing at a barely visible carving, a lotus with 9 petals etched into the stone. My chest tightened. This was the symbol we'd seen time and again in connection to the 9. Nearby, we discovered a camouflaged doorway cut into the cliff face. Excitement and dread warred within me as we pushed against the heavy stone slab. With a resonant scrape, it gave way, revealing a passage descending into darkness. Our flashlights revealed stone steps, polished smooth by ages of use, leading further underground. The air grew stale as we ventured deeper, our footsteps echoing ominously. This place was ancient, labyrinthine. We passed through a large antechamber adorned with faded murals, some depicting celestial beings, others showing scenes reminiscent of advanced astronomical diagrams. My spine tingled. Whoever built this place had knowledge that went beyond the typical medieval monastic tradition. At last, we reached a massive chamber that resembled a subterranean library. Alcoves lined the walls, filled with scrolls, tablets, and bound volumes of indeterminate age. A central dais held a low stone table. This was beyond anything I dared hope for. The entire expedition stood in awe. Huxley quickly began photographing everything while the graduate students carefully approached the shelves. I was about to step forward when I heard a whispered voice behind me. "Stop!" It was Thomason. She pointed to a small inscription on the floor near the entrance, partially obscured by dust. After a quick translation, we realized it was a warning, something like, "Only the prepared mind should proceed, lest devastation be unleashed." We debated whether to continue, but after coming this far, we couldn't simply turn back. We advanced carefully, treating the relics with reverent caution. Our linguist began examining a set of inscribed tablets, while Thomason took an interest in a bound volume with gold leaf edges. Huxley and I approached the dais. There, on a raised pedestal, lay a single book, older than anything I'd ever seen, its cover carved from a dark, smooth wood inlaid with metallic symbols. Was this the 9th book Menon had warned about? My heart thudded against my ribs. I reached out hesitantly. My fingertips brushed the cover, sending an electric thrill through me. The symbols glowed faintly. I recoiled, startled. This was impossible. A trick of the light, perhaps. Before I could reflect further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Armed men poured into the chamber, flashlights cutting harsh beams through the dark. The watchers had arrived. My team froze, half blinded by the sudden glare. Then, to my shock, 2 figures stepped forward. The tall, dark-haired man from Oxford and the short-haired companion who had used that incapacitating device. One of them barked, "Step away from the book! Nobody move!" His accent was nonspecific, his tone lethal. The watchers pointed weapons at us, sleek, modern firearms, not the dusty relics of some ancient cult. The graduate students huddled together, terrified. Huxley cursed under his breath. Thomason closed her eyes as if in silent prayer. Then, to my astonishment, she took a step forward, raising her hands. "We've come to protect this place, not to violate it," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. The dark-haired man's features twisted in scorn. "You have no idea what you've stumbled onto." His gaze flickered to me. "Dr. Bromley, you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? We tried to warn you." My stomach churned. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Guardians or pretenders? Why do you use violence if you claim to protect knowledge?" His companion chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. "Protect? We aim to control. This knowledge cannot fall into the hands of dreamers. It must be harnessed, wisely or unwisely. That's not for you to decide." A chill ran through me. Whatever their true affiliation with the Nine might be, they clearly intended to monopolize this treasure for their own ends. "And the 9 unknown men?" I forced out. "Are they real? Do they sanction this?" The tall man smirked. "The 9 are real, though fractured in their old age. Some cling to illusions of safeguarding humanity. Others understand that only through absolute power can we survive the perils ahead. We are the rightful heirs to that power." Before he could say more, an unexpected tremor shook the chamber. Dust rained down from the ceiling. A low rumble echoed through the passageways. Fear flashed across everyone's faces. Had our intrusion triggered some ancient defense mechanism? The watchers glanced around uneasily. Suddenly, a figure materialized from the shadows, an elderly man with a shaven head and a saffron robe, his eyes luminous in the torchlight. He seemed to appear out of thin air, defying all logic. My breath caught. Was he a monk? A guardian? "Lay down your arms," the old man's voice resonated, far stronger than his frail appearance suggested. "This knowledge is not for conquest." The watchers raised their weapons, unsure of the threat he posed. But the old man merely stepped forward. Another tremor rocked the chamber. The dais at the center began to glow faintly, the metallic inlays lighting up in patterns I couldn't comprehend. The watchers exchanged panicked looks, uncertain whether to flee or fire. The old man turned to me, his face grave. "You seek the truth of the Nine. Here it lies, yet it will cost you dearly." Without waiting for my response, he placed a hand on the wooden cover of the ninth book. The inscriptions flared, and for a moment I thought I saw spectral figures circling the dais, apparitions of robed individuals, each holding a different volume. My mind reeled. Was I hallucinating? A piercing shriek rang out. One of the watchers fired a shot. The old man collapsed, clutching his shoulder. Instantly, the dais unleashed a blinding flash of light. I threw up my arms to shield my eyes. The watchers shouted, some stumbling back, others firing blindly into the radiant glow. A wave of heat and force slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. Everything went white. For a few seconds or minutes, I lost all sense of time and place. When my vision cleared, the watchers were gone, their footsteps echoing in retreat through the corridors. My team lay scattered, dazed but alive. The old man was slumped against the dais, blood seeping from his wound. I crawled to his side, heart pounding. "We need to get help," I murmured. The old man gazed at me, pain etched on his face, yet his eyes retained that uncanny glow. He raised a trembling hand, pointing to the ninth book. "Take it. Keep it safe," he whispered. "The cycle must continue, or all is lost." His voice rattled, and then he was still. Tears burned my eyes. I glanced around. The subterranean library was damaged, stones dislodged from the ceiling, dust swirling in the eerie light. The ninth book lay on the dais, unmarked by the chaos. My colleagues watched, fear and wonder mingling in their expressions. I reached for the book, hands shaking. As soon as my fingers touched the cover, a surge of heat and knowledge coursed through me. Images, formulas, illusions of cosmic cycles. I recoiled, panting. Whatever this text was, it exceeded ordinary comprehension. We had no choice but to flee. The watchers might return with reinforcements. Supporting one another, we clambered out of the library, up the dark steps, and into the cold mountain air. Miraculously, the entire expedition emerged intact, though battered. I clutched the ninth book, wrapped hastily in cloth. For reasons I couldn't articulate, I knew I had to protect it. Our retreat was a blur of exhaustion and dread. Days later, we finally reached a secure location, still reeling from the confrontation. We had glimpsed a realm where myth bled into reality, where knowledge held the power to bend or break civilization. The watchers had been temporarily driven off, but they would never cease their pursuit. In hushed conferences, my team debated what to do with the ninth book. Should we destroy it, keep it hidden, or attempt to study it? Each option carried unimaginable consequences. The final decision fell on me as the nominal leader and the one who had inadvertently set all of this in motion. Episode 9, Finale. We found refuge in a remote monastery high in the mountains of Nepal, run by monks who owed allegiance to no state or faction. The abbot, an elderly and serene man, took us in without asking questions. He allowed us to use a small chamber for our group's deliberations. By this point, Most of our expedition members were physically and emotionally exhausted. Weeks of tension had taken their toll. Yet none of us could look away from the ninth book, a silent enigma wrapped in cloth on a table at the center. The abbot paid us a brief visit that first evening. With a compassionate gaze, he glanced at the book. Then he addressed me softly. "Not all burdens are meant to be carried alone." The cryptic statement weighed heavily on my mind as I tried to sleep on a thin straw mat, my dreams filled with swirling symbols and half-formed equations that dissolved as soon as I woke. At dawn, Thomason, Huxley, and I convened in the small chamber, shutting the wooden door behind us. The others, too shaken to continue, waited in the courtyard. Nervously, we unwrapped the ninth book. Its carved wooden cover seemed inert in the morning light, the metallic inlays dull. Huxley, always the rationalist, suggested we attempt a systematic study. "We have the equipment to take photographs, do rubbings, even note the script," he said. "We can be scientific about this." Yet the memory of the lethal flash in the library and the old man's final words made me hesitate. Something about this book defied normal academic protocols. "Let's start slowly," I agreed, my voice trembling despite myself. "Just examine the first page. See if we can identify the script." Carefully, we opened the cover. The first page was thick, parchment-like, covered in symbols reminiscent of Sanskrit, but woven with abstract glyphs we couldn't decipher. As soon as we leaned in to study them, I felt a soft hum beneath my fingertips, a low vibration like a distant chant. A wave of warmth flowed through me, followed by strange flashes of insight, images of swirling galaxies, ephemeral shapes of luminous beings, a sense of time folding in on itself. I jerked back, gasping. Huxley stared at me, alarmed. "Edgar, are you all right?" I wiped the sweat from my brow. I don't know. I felt something." My voice quavered. "It's like the book is alive, or it's channeling something beyond normal understanding." Thomason placed a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe we shouldn't do this. We've all seen enough." But Huxley, despite his earlier caution, was transfixed. "If this text truly offers advanced knowledge, medicine, physics, cosmic secrets, think of what we could achieve. Imagine cures for deadly diseases, breakthroughs in energy. We can't just lock it away." A heated debate erupted. Thomason worried about the Watchers, the risk of unleashing destructive forces. Huxley argued that to hide the book was a crime against humanity's potential. I oscillated between both viewpoints, recalling my vow as a historian to preserve knowledge, yet also recalling the lethal potential hinted at by centuries of legends. Eventually, we agreed on a compromise, to photograph and analyze only a few pages for now, to ascertain the nature of the content without delving too deep. We set up a makeshift photography station near a window. The sunlight filtered through a gauzy curtain, illuminating the script. Thomason carefully turned the pages while Huxley snapped pictures. I stood by, a knot of anxiety in my stomach. As we worked, we noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere, a faint breeze stirring through the closed room, a whisper of chanting in the corners of our hearing. The temperature seemed to fluctuate. After we finished photographing about a dozen pages, a sense of dread pressed down on me. It felt as if we were prying open a cosmic door that was never meant to be opened so casually. In the hallway outside, footsteps approached. The abbot entered, inclining his head respectfully. "You have done what you believe is right," he said, "but knowledge can be as deadly as it is illuminating. Are you prepared for the burden that now follows you wherever you go?" The question hung in the air. None of us answered. The abbot bowed slightly and left, leaving us alone with the silent, inscrutable ninth book. We decided to conceal the book in the monastery for the time being. The abbot offered to keep it in a hidden vault deep in the compound. Our plan was to return to England with the photographs, analyze them in a secure environment, and then decide our next course. A part of me whispered that once parted from the book, we might never see it again, but we had few better options. The next morning, we prepared to depart. The abbot led us to a subterranean chamber. Its walls were lined with ancient relics, lit by a solitary oil lamp. With a sense of finality, we placed the ninth book inside a locked chest. As the abbot sealed it, a soft tremor seemed to pass through the room, like the valley itself acknowledging our deed. We left, our hearts heavy. The watchers might still be out there, hunting for the ninth book. But for now, it was safe. I prayed the abbot's sanctified ground would deter any attempts to seize it. The return journey was uneventful, almost eerily so. We reached Kathmandu with little interference, then flew to London under assumed travel arrangements. Every step of the way, we kept a low profile, mindful of eyes that might be tracking our movements. By the time we arrived in England, winter's chill had set in, a stark contrast to the mountain air we'd left behind. Back at Oxford, the few months that followed were a strange interlude. Huxley and I painstakingly examined the photographs, each of which showed text and faint diagrams that defied immediate translation. The script seemed to combine Sanskrit with a code we couldn't break. Yet the shapes of certain diagrams suggested advanced geometry or energy manipulation. Though we shared some details with trusted colleagues, we kept the images under lock and key. Thomason distanced herself from the project, citing the mental toll. I could hardly blame her. We'd all been through an ordeal that tested the limits of our rational worldview. Despite our precautions, rumors swirled. Whispers of Bromley's secret expedition circulated in academic circles. At one point, Dr. Avery summoned me again, warning that the Royal Society was growing impatient for concrete results. I gave a carefully sanitized briefing, omitting all mention of the watchers and the ninth book's extraordinary properties, and assured her a proper paper was forthcoming. She dismissed me with a thin-lipped glare, suspecting more than I let on. Late one night, as I was finalizing a section of my manuscript, my lamp flickered. A wave of unease swept over me. I opened my desk drawer to check the photographs of the ninth book. They were gone. My pulse thundered. I searched frantically, turning the room upside down, but the packet of images had vanished without a trace. A harsh chill settled in my bones. Someone had stolen the only tangible proof we possessed. Had the watchers infiltrated my study? In a panic, I raced to Huxley's office, only to find it locked and dark. I pounded on the door until a night custodian told me Huxley had left hours ago. Defeated, I sank against the wall, a swirl of dread filling my thoughts. Was our entire effort undone? Without the photographs, we had no evidence, no leverage. The watchers had presumably taken the last piece of the puzzle. Unless, was there a traitor within our ranks? My mind flashed to Thomason, to her secret communications with that other faction, or even to Huxley, whose ambition might overshadow caution. I didn't want to believe any of them could betray me. A week of fruitless searching passed. The photographs did not reappear, nor did any new threats or letters arrive. It was as if the watchers had decided we were no longer a threat now that we possessed no proof. But the question of the ninth book's safety gnawed at me. Could the monastery remain secure forever? And what of the watcher's vow to control that knowledge? Then, on a grey, drizzling afternoon, a package arrived in my office. No return address, but the postmark read India. My heart leapt. It had to be from Manon. I tore it open. Inside was a single object, a small metal box with intricate carvings. It resembled the device the Watchers had used in the Himalayan monastery, though slightly different in design. Accompanying it was a note in Menon's familiar handwriting. Edgar, I have found allies among those who truly uphold the Nine's legacy. They trust you, but caution that the cycle must be maintained. Enclosed is a key. When placed upon the ninth book, it will seal its power. Use it only if you must, for it carries a price. I'm sorry for everything. May we meet again in better days. SM. My hands shook as I read and reread the note. A wave of relief and dread washed over me. Menon was alive, still fighting the good fight somewhere in the east. He had entrusted me with something that could influence the fate of the ninth book. Did that mean the Watchers had not yet seized the library, or that a final confrontation was looming? In a swirl of confusion, I realized the choice before me: to go back, to protect the ninth book once and for all, or to leave it to fate. My life at Oxford was in tatters, my credibility hanging by a thread. The Watchers still lurked, though they had gone silent. A sense of cosmic gravity seemed to pull me toward that hidden monastery, where the final act of this grand drama would inevitably unfold. Weeks passed. I wrestled with the decision alone, ignoring the daily demands of academic life. Finally, on a night when the wind howled across the Oxford spires, I packed a small valise. Gripping Menon's device in my coat pocket, I left a note on my desk. To whom it may concern, I am leaving to finalize my research. The answers lie in the East. Should I not return, know that some truths are too vast to fit neatly within our institutions. Seek wisdom, not just knowledge, and remember that every discovery carries responsibility. Edgar Bromley. I slipped out of my flat under the cover of darkness, heart pounding but strangely at peace. At Southampton, I booked passage on a vessel bound for India. I had no illusions about the peril ahead, yet something deeper than fear guided me now, a sense of calling, perhaps. The 9 unknown men, the Watchers, the ninth book. It was all part of a tapestry that spanned centuries, and I was but one thread woven into its pattern. And here, dear colleagues, is where my story ends, at least as far as I can tell it. Whether I succeed in sealing the ninth book's power or die in the attempt, I cannot say. My only hope is that the cycle will lead to growth rather than destruction, that the knowledge of the 9 can be preserved for humanity's highest good. If you are reading these words, perhaps you have glimpsed the same hidden truths that consumed me. In that case, be warned. The line between legend and fact is razor-thin, and the Watchers are always near. I will leave you with a final thought. It is not the knowledge itself that is evil, but the hearts into which it is entrusted. The 9 unknown men understood that truth long ago. May their wisdom guide us through whatever darkness lies ahead. You, who have read my account, may think me deluded or lost to fantasies. Yet as I pen these final lines in my cabin on the steamer, I sense a presence, an overwhelming certainty that I have been here before. In dreams, I see the face of Emperor Ashoka, his gaze mournful yet resolute. I recall battles I never fought, empires I never ruled, and edicts I never carved. A voice echoes in my mind: the cycle must continue. When I glance in the mirror, for a fleeting moment, I see Ashoka's face superimposed over my own. Perhaps it is a trick of the wavering lamplight, or perhaps reincarnation is more than myth. My hand trembles. If I am, in some distant thread of existence, bound to that ancient emperor, then my role in this drama is no accident. The 9 unknown men might yet recognize me, or perhaps they already have. Soon, I will land on the shores of India once more. The Watchers will converge, allies will reveal themselves, and the ninth book will beckon with its timeless secrets. My fate, and the fate of countless souls, may hinge on what transpires next. I leave these words in the Royal Society's care, uncertain if they will be believed. But truth, like the river, finds its own course. Let history judge me, or forget me. My journey continues far beyond these written pages in realms where destiny and time entwine. And so ends my testimony, a tapestry woven from dust, dreams, and the weight of an ancient oath. Should you ever hear whispers of nine who guard the cosmos' greatest treasures, remember my story. Remember that even a humble historian from Oxford can stumble into the footsteps of kings, drawn by the echo of a secret older than any empire. And if the cycle indeed repeats, pray that in the next turning we prove ourselves worthy of the gifts we guard.